Welcome. I am Tom Schuster, and this is Christianity Unearthed, the 4,000-year rise and fall of Christianity. This is the winner's tale, before Christianity became orthodoxy. Episode 4, Antioch and Syria, the crucible of transition. When the smoke of Jerusalem faded, and the survivors stepped onto the open roads, they entered a world Jesus himself had never walked. A world of ports and caravan trails, of languages colliding in the streets, of gods and rituals layered on top of one another. A world where identity was fluid, and nothing held still for long. The first great city on that road was Antioch, dazzling, chaotic, unpredictable. If Jerusalem had been the cradle of the movement, Antioch would become its first crucible. Antioch was founded in the 4th century BC by Seleucus I, one of Alexander the Great's successors. He built it as a Greek polis, colonnaded streets, temples, theatres, gymnasia, civic squares. But the indigenous Syrian population remained. Then came Armenians, Arabs, Jews, Persians, Romans, until Antioch became a city of overlapping worlds. Merchants shouted in Greek from their stalls, fishermen bargained in Aramaic, philosophers argued in the Stoas, astrologers sold predictions by the river. Jewish families kept kosher in one corner, while worshippers of Apollo offered incense in another. Nothing in the earliest Jesus movement prepared them for this. Antioch was not merely larger than Jerusalem, it was different in kind. Most people in Antioch spoke Greek, not Aramaic. So when Jesus' followers arrived from Judea, they found themselves praying and debating in a language Jesus had never used. One more sign that the movement was already crossing into a new world. When followers of Jesus arrived here after the destruction of the temple, they found themselves in a world where every meal, every friendship, every household gathering forced new questions of belonging. They still kept Sabbath and read the Hebrew scriptures. They still prayed for the kingdom, but the ground beneath their feet was shifting. In Jerusalem, everyone around them shared the same reference points: Torah, temple, covenant, festival, purity. In Antioch, those reference points no longer applied. Here, Jews and Gentiles lived side by side, not as occasional neighbors, but as intimate participants in each other's daily lives. Believers gathered in homes, not synagogues. Meals became moments of both unity and strain. What one ate, and with whom, carried meaning. They were not abstract theological questions. They were social ones, cultural ones, human ones. Antioch forced the movement to ask something Jerusalem never had to confront. Can a Jewish messianic movement survive outside Judaism? Even before doctrinal questions arose, Antioch demanded answers. What do we do when people join the movement who do not keep kosher? What counts as belonging in a city where belonging has so many meanings? Antioch did not destroy the movement's unity. This was a cosmopolitan crucible, not a regional refuge, a place where boundaries dissolved faster than they could be redrawn, a place where everything familiar had to be reinterpreted. And it is here, in Antioch's crowded markets and narrow side streets, that the followers of Jesus were first called Christianoi, Christ people. The name almost certainly came from outsiders. Romans used the suffix ianoi to label factions and followers of public figures. Herodians, Pompeians, Caesareans. To a Roman ear, Christianoi meant something like the Christ Party, a nickname, a category, not a religious identity. But names have a way of sticking, even when they are accidents. And in Antioch, a city of many identities, a new one took shape, not because anyone planned it, but because the old categories no longer held. A movement born inside Judaism was becoming something else, not by intention, but by environment. In our previous episode, we explored the famous confrontation between Peter and Paul, a conflict that erupted in this very city. In brief, Peter had been eating freely with Gentile believers until emissaries from Jerusalem arrived, and under their pressure he withdrew, prompting Paul to confront him publicly over the meaning of belonging. We will not retell it now. It is enough to say that the clash happened here because Antioch made it inevitable. Antioch exposed the fault lines that had been hidden in Jerusalem. Antioch forced choices that could no longer be postponed. Antioch revealed that the movement's future would not be decided in the temple's shadow, but in the marketplaces and households of the wider world. But Antioch was not the final shape of that transformation. To understand the full metamorphosis, the shift from memory to manuscript, from prophecy to poetry, from oral tradition to literary innovation, we must follow the movement further east, beyond Antioch's colonnades and bustling thoroughfares, into a land where imagination, vision, and text carried more authority than any city ever could. A land of prophets and scribes, of poets and ascetics, where Christianity learned to sing. Syria. When the road leaves Antioch and begins to climb through the broken terrain towards the Euphrates, the air changes, the land opens, cities thin, the empire loosens its grip, and the Jesus movement enters a world that will reshape it more radically than Jerusalem or Antioch ever had. Beyond Antioch lay Syria, a vast border region of trade routes, tribal territories, and ancient kingdoms, where ideas travelled as easily as caravans, and where cultures merged with little regard for boundaries. This was not a single province in the modern sense. It was a mosaic. Villages along the Orontes, towns perched on hillsides, and eastern cities like Orsoni, Edessa, and Nisibis, each with its own languages, traditions, schools, and gods. The Roman frontier did not divide this world so much as outline it. Syria was a threshold, a filter, a crossroads where Judaism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, local Semitic traditions, and Hellenistic philosophy passed through each other like voices in a crowded marketplace. Here, the Jesus movement did not simply spread, it changed its shape. In Jerusalem, the movement had grown from a Jewish root. In Antioch, it learned to live in a mixed city. In Syria, it encountered a landscape where religion was not primarily a matter of law or civic identity, but of story, symbol, vision, and song. This was a world of prophets and scribes, of ascetics who wandered the roads, of teachers who spoke in parables and riddles, and of poets who believed that truth lived in imagery rather than argument. When Christianity entered this world, its language had to stretch. Syria did not ask who belongs. It asked, how do we speak? How do we remember? How do we imagine? In Syria, Christianity found itself speaking in Syriac, an Eastern form of Aramaic. Syriac was supple, musical, full of metaphor and parallelism. It had the cadence of chant and the rhythm of poetry. Where Greek carved ideas with precision, Syriac wrapped them in imagery. And so Jesus' story came to be retold in new accents. His teachings were remembered not only as directives, but as the seeds of hymns. His parables were repeated with stylistic flourish. His healings became symbolic patterns. His sayings, rooted in Judea, were translated into a language shaped by desert spirituality and Eastern cosmologies. Even when the content was the same, the tone was different. To a Syriac ear, Jesus was not merely a teacher or miracle worker. He was a cosmic figure, a healer of creation, a light woven into the fabric of the world. And so, Christianity acquired a new voice. Not Alexandrian philosophy, not Roman administration, not Judean law, but Syrian imagination. In these eastern regions, prophecy was not rare, it was expected. Borderlands breed visionaries. The Didache, a Jewish Christian teaching manual, likely written in Syria or adjacent regions, spends considerable effort warning communities about wandering prophets, how to test them, how to recognize sincerity, how to resist exploitation. A text does not warn about a phenomenon unless it is common. Paul himself had confronted the same problem decades earlier. In his earliest letters, he urges communities to, quote, test everything, hold fast to what is good, a warning against the flood of prophetic voices already claiming spiritual authority. His letters to Corinth reveal gatherings overwhelmed by ecstatic speech, competing revelations, and self-appointed prophets who challenged his teaching. The Didache reflects this same landscape, a movement overflowing with charisma, but in desperate need of discernment. And indeed, Syria was full of prophetic figures. Some travelled from village to village, delivering messages of judgment or consolation. Some healed. Some spoke in ecstatic utterances. Others recited visions that blurred the line between instruction and revelation. For many communities, prophecy was more authoritative than text. A movement with no central canon, no bishops, and no fixed structures could be guided as easily by a prophet's voice as by a visiting teacher's letter. Here, the Jesus movement did not lose its Jewish apocalyptic inheritance. It amplified it. The end was always near. The Spirit always spoke, and visions were windows into the meaning of history. This charismatic environment did not compete with literary creativity, it fed it. Stories, hymns, and written teachings grew out of this world of visions, like plants taking root in fertile soil. But to understand just how fluid, competitive, and chaotic this spiritual landscape could be, we must pause for a moment on one of the most extraordinary figures ever to appear in early Christian memory. A man whose story reveals how easily history and legend could be fused, embroidered, and weaponized. His name was Simon, remembered later as Simon Magus, Simon the magician. And over time, he became the great villain of Christian storytelling. The earliest account of Simon appears in the book of Acts. Acts says that in Samaria, not far from the Syrian borderland, there lived a man who practiced magical arts, astonishing the population. He had a following and drew crowds. People said of him, quote, "This man is the great power of God." When followers of Jesus came preaching in the region, Acts claims that Simon, quote, believed and was baptized. But the story quickly turns theatrical. According to Acts, when Simon saw the apostles laying hands on people and imparting the Spirit, he approached them with money and said, quote, "Give me also this power." Peter, replies with indignation, condemning Simon for thinking, quote, that the gift of God could be purchased. It was a dramatic scene, but even within the New Testament, it reads more like allegory than biography. We are not told who Simon actually was or what he taught. We are only told that he was a rival whom the apostles swiftly rebuked. And this is where the history ends, and where the mythology begins. In the century that followed, Christian writers embellished Simon's story far beyond anything found in Acts. Justin Martyr, writing from Rome around 150 CE, claimed that Simon journeyed to Rome and was worshipped there as a god, even receiving a statue on the Tiber Island. Later scholarship showed that the statue in question honored Sancus, a Sabine deity. Early Christians had simply misread an inscription. But the legend took root. Irenaeus went further. Writing in the late 2nd century, he declared Simon, quote, the origin of all heresies, the fountain from which every non-orthodox Christian movement flowed. This is polemic, not history. It tells us far more about the anxieties of later bishops than about Simon himself. By the 3rd century, in the Acts of Peter, a vivid, imaginative text, not historical in any sense, Simon is portrayed performing wonders in Rome. One scene from the Acts of Peter became especially famous and reveals just how far the story had drifted from any historical memory. In this tale, Simon boasts that he can rise into the air by the power of the angels. Before a large Roman crowd, he lifts off the ground and begins to hover above the city. The crowd is astonished. Some declare him divine, but Peter stands below and prays that God would expose the deception. At that moment, the story says, Simon falls from the sky, crashes to the ground, and breaks his legs. The people turn on him. Peter is vindicated. It is theatrical, dramatic, and entirely legendary. Yet, for 1,300 years, this was the story many Christians believed when they imagined Peter's triumph over false teachers. The episode shows how, in the competition for authority, myth proved more powerful than memory. The image is unforgettable. The theology is unmistakable. Peter triumphs, the rival is humiliated, and the church's authority is vindicated through spectacle. But nothing in these elaborations comes from the 1st century. Nothing resembles the sober, brief mention in Acts. Nothing can be traced to eyewitness memory. Simon becomes whatever later writers needed him to be: a sorcerer, a villain, a foil, a myth. The real Simon, whoever he was, disappears behind the caricature. One of the most enduring stories from the Acts of Peter takes place far from the arenas and the crowds. It begins with Peter fleeing. Nero's persecution had grown severe, and the Roman Christians begged Peter to save himself. He left the city along the Appian Way, the ancient stone road leading south. As he walked, he saw a figure approaching, a man carrying a quiet authority. Peter recognized him. He asked in Latin, the language of the empire, Domine, quo vadis? Lord, where are you going? And Jesus replied, I am going to Rome to be crucified again. The meaning in this story is unmistakable. If Peter abandons the community, Jesus will have to take his place. His flight is not escape, it is betrayal. Peter turns around and walks back towards the city. The legend says he is arrested soon after and chooses to be crucified upside down, claiming that he is unworthy to die in the same manner as Jesus. None of this appears in the New Testament. All of it comes from the imaginative storytelling of the early Christian centuries. Stories later absorbed into tradition long after their origins were forgotten. And this is why his story matters. It reveals how early Christian communities, lacking centralized leadership or agreed texts, constructed their past through stories that worked as warnings, lessons, and identity markers. It reveals how villains could be invented or exaggerated to justify authority. It reveals how theological conflict produced mythological memory. The Acts of Peter were never accepted as scripture, but for almost 3 centuries, it shaped Christian imagination far more than the New Testament did. The Catholic Church rejected it as apocryphal, yet absorbed its stories. Peter's upside-down crucifixion, his battle with Simon Magus, the Quo Vadis encounter, which became part of official tradition long after the text itself was suppressed. Acts invented Simon Magus in the 1st century. The Acts of Peter embellishes the story in the 3rd. It is a window into how the past was shaped and misshaped long before the filter of empire hardened Christian identity into a single official narrative. Further east lay Edessa, the capital of Orsoni, perched between Rome and Persia. Edessa was not a large city, but it was an important one, a center of scribal culture, translation and religious innovation. Later tradition claimed that Edessa became the first Christian kingdom, ruled by King Abgar, who converted after corresponding with Jesus. The story is almost certainly legendary, but legends arise where soil allows them to grow. What is certain is that by the early 2nd century, Edessa hosted a thriving Christian community. It was not a transplanted Jerusalem group or a satellite of Antioch, but its own world, Syriac-speaking, text-producing, and already experimenting with ways to integrate the Jesus movement into local culture. Here, stories of Jesus circulated in new forms. Some versions leaned more heavily on Jewish ethical traditions. Others were influenced by Greek narrative styles. Still others blended Jesus' sayings with local wisdom literature. Edessa's Christianity was not governed by councils or hierarchies. Its leaders were teachers, prophets, and poets. Its authority lay in the power of its texts. The Gospel of Matthew, likely finalized in or near Antioch, became deeply influential in Syria. Matthew spoke the language of a Jewish Christian imagination. Jesus as the new Moses, Jesus upholding the law, Jesus fulfilling Scripture. But Matthew also commanded teaching. Quote, "Go and make disciples, teaching them to observe everything I have commanded you." This commission resonated in Edessa and beyond, where communal identity depended not on temple ritual or inherited tradition, but on instruction, memory, and written teaching. Syria adopted Matthew with enthusiasm, but it also transformed him. In Edessa, Matthew might be read beside Aramaic sayings traditions, prophetic visions, or local stories that had no parallels in Judea. Jesus' words were familiar, but the atmosphere, the interpretive frame, the emotional coloring were different. And where Matthew ended with a command to teach, Syria responded by creating teachers. A new class of Christian scribes and poets who shape memory through writing rather than through inherited ritual. As oral memory struggled to preserve unity across vast distances, Syrian Christianity turned to literature, not as a replacement for prophecy, but as its partner. They recited teachings from memory. They copied Gospels in Syriac. They composed hymns to accompany baptism and Eucharist. They wrote stories about martyrs, heroes, and holy men whose ascetic lives symbolized the struggle of the soul against the world. Syria transformed Christianity's relationship to text. In Jerusalem, Scripture had been inherited. In Antioch, it was being translated. In Syria, it was being created. And one text, above all, would remake the story of Jesus in this region and shaped how entire generations understood his life. The Diatessaron. By the mid-2nd century, the Jesus movement in Syria had matured into something unmistakably distinct. It was still tied to the memories of Jerusalem and shaped by the debates of Antioch, but it had developed a voice that belonged to neither. Its questions were different, its imagination was different, its sense of how to remember Jesus was different, and nothing reveals that more vividly than what happened to the Gospels. Sometime around 170 CE, a figure named Tatian returned to Syria. Tatian had not formed his ideas in isolation. Before returning east, he had spent years in Rome as a student of Justin Martyr, the great Christian apologist who tried to present the faith as the true philosophy of the empire. Justin represented a direction of Christianity that would later harden into orthodoxy. Tatian absorbed that world, but when he returned to Syria, he reshaped it through the lens of his own culture. He did not imitate Justin, he transformed him. And the result was the Diatessaron, a gospel unlike anything the Roman Church would later accept. Syria pulled him home. When he came back, he brought with him 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 4 voices, 4 structures, 4 portraits of Jesus, sometimes harmonious, sometimes contradictory, but always distinct. For many Christians in the West, this diversity would later become foundational. But for Tatian and for Syrian imagination, 4 competing stories were not a gift, they were a problem to be solved. So Tatian solved it. He took the 4 Gospels and wove them into one continuous narrative, a single seamless account of Jesus' life. He called it the Diatessaron, through 4. It did not merely arrange the Gospels, it reshaped them. Where Mark was abrupt, Tatian smoothed him. Where Matthew and Luke diverged, Tatian harmonized them. Where John soared into cosmic language, Tatian opened his story with those very lines. Quote, "In the beginning was the Word." In the Diatessaron, there are no 4 portraits of Jesus. There is one, a tapestry in which contradictions dissolve and narrative unity reigns. For nearly 2 centuries, this was the gospel of the East. Children in Edessa learned about Jesus from the Diatessaron, not from Matthew or Luke. Priests preached from it. Singers set passages to melody. The 4-fold gospel existed, but in Syria it was Tatian's harmony that shaped memory. Later bishops would try to suppress it, especially Rabula of Edessa in the 5th century, insisting on the authority of the 4 separate gospels. But suppression reveals influence, not obscurity. You do not ban what no one reads. The Diatessaron thrived because it matched Syria's literary instincts. One story, one flow, one voice. And it embodies a crucial truth about the first 3 centuries. Christian memory was still fluid. still being shaped, still open to the hands of those who retold the story. There was no canon to violate, there was only tradition in motion. While Tatian crafted a new gospel, another figure was reshaping Christian thought through poetry, philosophy, and cosmic speculation. Bardaisan was born in Edessa around 154 CE. Educated in both Greek philosophy and Eastern mystical traditions, and trained as a court poet. His world straddled Rome and Persia. He debated astrologers about fate. He wrote hymns about the soul's journey. He composed treatises describing the complexity of creation, one of which, the Book of the Laws of Countries, survives in Syriac. Bardaisan asked questions that the Jerusalem community had never had to consider. If God is just, why do nations live under different laws? If stars govern destiny, how can humans be free? If Jesus reveals the truth, how does that truth relate to the world governed by cosmic powers? He argued that God's providence overrides astral determinism. A bold claim in a world where astrology shaped politics, medicine, and identity, and would continue to do so until the late 16th century. To later orthodoxy, Bardaisan would appear suspicious, too syncretic, but in his own time he represented the range of what early Christianity could be when it lived at a cultural frontier. In Edessa, theology did not have to choose between poetry and argument, symbol and doctrine. It could be all of these at once. Syria also became home for Ascetic movements, groups whose commitment to purity took radical forms. Some rejected marriage entirely, believing that sexual renunciation restored the innocence of Eden. Others abstained from meat and wine, embraced rigorous fasting, or withdrew into the desert to pursue a contemplative life. Among them were the Encratites, who saw themselves not as extremists, but as restorers of Jesus' original demand for purity and self-mastery. To them, Paul's warnings about the desires of the flesh were not metaphors, but mandates. Syria understood these ascetics. Its cultural world had long honoured wandering prophets and solitary holy men. Its religious imagination was shaped not only by Judaism and Christianity, but by centuries of contact with Eastern religious discipline. Asceticism in Syria was not a deviation, it was an expression of the region's spiritual temperament, and it too shaped how Jesus was remembered. In ascetic circles, he appeared less as a teacher of Torah and more as a healer of souls, a revealer of paths, a model of purity and spiritual authority. This was not the Jesus of Peter's sermons in Jerusalem. It was not the Jesus of Paul's letters. It was a Jesus adapted for a world where the body itself was the battleground of holiness. A century after Bardaisan, Syria produced one of Christianity's greatest artists, Ephrem the Syrian. He was a deacon, preacher, and teacher, but above all he was a poet. Ephrem wrote hymns in Syriac, filled with shimmering images. His theology is inseparable from his poetry. He wrote, quote, "Blessed is the one who became small, so that the small might not be lost." And elsewhere, "In the womb of Mary, the fire and the Spirit wove a garment of glory." For Ephrem, metaphor was not decoration, it was revelation. He battled heresies through hymns, not treatises. He taught through melody, not syllogism. He shaped the imagination of Syrian Christianity for centuries, and his influence spread even to Greek and Latin traditions, though often uncredited. If Tatian gave Syria a single gospel, Ephrem gave it the language to interpret it. East of Edessa, the city of Nisibis became a center of Christian scholarship. It stood at the edge of empire, where Roman and Persian forces clashed repeatedly, creating a city where teachers had to defend ideas in a world that never stopped shifting. From Nisibis emerged early forms of what would later become the Antiochian school, a method of biblical interpretation that emphasized historical context, careful reading, and the plain sense of the text. It was a counterweight to the symbolic style of Alexandria. But Nisibis was never merely intellectual. It absorbed the poetic imagination of Edessa, the prophetic atmosphere of the borderlands, and the missionary energy of Antioch. Its scholars wrote commentaries, its teachers shaped liturgy, and its ideas traveled along trade routes into Armenia, Persia, and even India. Nisibis shows us something essential. Syria was not just a place where stories were told. It was a place where stories were interpreted, where memory was shaped, where texts were crafted for communities who needed both beauty and clarity. By the late 2nd and 3rd centuries, the influence of Antioch and Syria had begun to solidify into a new expression of Christian identity. It was multilingual, hybrid, and open to reinterpretation. It was confident enough to harmonise gospels, poeticize theology, challenge astrology, and reimagine Jesus in symbolic forms. This was not the Christianity of bishops and creeds, not yet. It was a movement in motion, shaped by distance, diversity, and the absence of central authority. Antioch had confronted the movement with plurality. Syria had confronted it with imagination. Together they asked questions Jerusalem had never needed to ask. What happens to a faith when it crosses culture? What happens to memory when it travels in many languages? What happens when Jesus is remembered in 4 discordant gospels or in one harmony? The answers were local, not universal, but they were real, and they left marks that later orthodoxy could never fully erase. By the time the movement reached Syria, the world that had given birth to it was gone. There was no temple, no Jerusalem center, no settled chain of authority, no body capable of adjudicating disputes. What remained was a network of communities linked by memory, but shaped by their surroundings. Antioch had shown that belonging could no longer be defined by ancestry or law. In that city of mixed languages and mixed tables, the movement discovered that it could not live as a Jewish sect and simultaneously welcome Gentiles without changing something fundamental about itself. The conflict between Peter and Paul, which erupted on Antioch's streets, was not an isolated moment, but the first clear sign that Christianity had entered a plural world where identity would be negotiated, not inherited. Syria took the transformation further. Here, Christianity encountered new ways of speaking about God, new literary forms, new symbolic languages. The Diatessaron harmonized multiple gospels into a single narrative. Bardaisan wrote hymns that blended scripture with Eastern cosmology. Prophets, teachers, ascetics, and philosophers all shaped the movement in their own ways. In Syria, Christians did not simply preserve traditions, they reimagined them. This did not mean the movement abandons its roots. It meant the roots were being transplanted into unfamiliar soil, where they grew in unexpected directions. Some communities emphasized Jesus as teacher, others as cosmic revealer, still others as ascetic model, visionary light, or embodiment of divine wisdom. These differences did not yet produce schism, they produced creativity. There was no orthodoxy here, not because Christians rejected truth, but because truth was still being discovered. Memory circulated across languages, stories shifted as they were retold, texts were composed, recopied, interpreted, expanded. No one possessed the whole picture, no one yet claimed the authority to impose one. Looking back from later centuries, it is tempting to imagine that these paths were converging. They were not, they were diverging, branching through cultures, philosophies, and imaginations that Jesus' earliest followers could never have foreseen. What held the movement together was not doctrinal agreement, but a shared conviction that Jesus mattered, that his life revealed something of God, and that his story needed to be told. It was only later, when empire sought unity, that these paths were narrowed into a single approved form. But before that narrowing, Antioch and Syria reveal a Christianity still alive with possibilities, a religion that did not yet know it was becoming one, and a movement that had not yet been captured by a single memory. This has been episode 4, Antioch and Syria, the Crucible of Transition, of Season 1 of The Winner's Tale. From here, the story turns westward to the cities of Asia Minor, above all to Ephesus, where the questions opened in Antioch and Syria began to fracture Christian memory itself. In that world of Ephesus, the identity of Christ becomes the fault line, and the dispute we first glimpse in these eastern communities will erupt into open conflict in the west of Asia Minor. Only after that, further south in Alexandria, will these tensions be systematized into the great battles of Christian theology.